The British economy is in a bit of a mess at the moment, to put it mildly. Unemployment is rising, salaries are stagnating, houses are unaffordable, cities are going bankrupt, and our public utilities are in dire disrepair, and people are covering this shortfall with debt. But what if I told you that we have actually been here before, and that this slump was set in motion almost 60 years ago, with these boring British townhouses? These quintessentially British living quarters are the remnants of a forgotten financial crisis that actually saw house prices become even more unaffordable than they are today. Depending on who you ask, the 1960s was either an era of free love and radical thought, or an overrated blip of colour in a drab decade. Either way, when it came to the economy, Britain was going through a dark period. And it was all because of the housing situation. Victorian architecture and quaint villages were torn up to be replaced by brutalist tower blocks and commercial centres. Instead of white picket fences, suburbia sprawled with glaring brickwork and factory backdrops. Architects believed they were paving the way for a utopian vision, where more people could live closer together, with more neighbours for a stronger community. In reality, the rapid growth of the housing market almost tanked the country's finances completely. And those tower blocks didn't house any more people than the streets anyway. They needed more space to separate the community housing as per health and safety considerations. And instead of improving the living conditions of the growing population, the rows of subpar new builds made things worse for everyone. But the spoiling of the British landscape wasn't just down to wannabe revolutionaries. It was a result of the government trying to control the economy with strict mortgage rationing. The post-war boom was over and the rise in population was getting expensive. In 1964, Harold Wilson's Labour Party ended the Conservative Party's 13-year rule. Under Tory reign, economic growth had been inconsistent, especially when compared to Her Majesty's European neighbours. Britain's annual trade deficit was around £800 million, which was about 1.8% of the GDP. Returns on foreign assets helped decrease the deficits, though a lot of that had already been sold off to fund both world wars. But it also came from borrowing from foreign lenders and the sales and returns of domestic UK assets. However, this weakened the pound and created a double-edged sword. On the one hand, British assets became cheaper to invest in. Foreign investment paid for the gap between imports and exports. The downside was foreign imports became too expensive. In the end, people bought less of them. Nowadays, balancing a deficit this low wouldn't be much of a problem. Unfortunately, Britain didn't have an adequate system in place back then. In essence, the dam had sprung a leak, but fixing it wasn't as simple as it seemed. Britain needed a way for domestic assets to become cheaper to balance outflows of foreign currency. However, Britain also needed a way to ensure that imports didn't become more expensive because then they'd lose foreign money. They had to act fast, but not hastily. So, Wilson's government did the usual things like cutting spending, raising taxes, and hiking interest rates to protect the pound. But these were just temporary solutions, like slapping on some cheap wall filler to the giant cracks in your dam. That's why Wilson also did something risky. He reduced wages and prices without an increase in interest rates. Basically, he banned prices from getting any higher. His logic was that limiting access to credit would stabilise the housing market while broadening the economy. As housing was set to become a real strain on the economy due to the baby boom, it made sense to focus on this sector. Unrestricted lending could lead to bubbles and financial catastrophe, so, Wilson thought, if he could control who gets a mortgage and how much they could borrow, the risks from excessive borrowing and speculative investing would be mitigated. In many ways, this was the opposite of the 2008 housing market. That was caused by complacent bankers giving mortgages to people who they knew wouldn't have been able to pay it back. On this occasion, Wilson was overcautious about finding the most dependable citizens to buttress the costs of the growing sector. But this created its own financial crisis. What was the point in limiting mortgages for people who didn't even want the houses in the first place? Restricting supply without demand had devastating consequences on British living standards for decades to come. However, Wilson's gamble seemed logical. The economy was fragile, the pound was weakening, An unregulated for-profit property market could benefit the few over the many. So how exactly did these prudent policies lead to a worse financial crisis? And will Britain repeat the same mistakes now that the cost of living is the highest it's ever been? It's time to learn how history works as we remember Britain's forgotten financial crisis. In 1965, 1 year after Wilson's Labour government came to power, banks were ordered to cap all lending at 105% of the nominal monthly rate. The time to put Wilson's plan into action had officially begun. Yet his gambit had two immediate, unfortunate consequences. The first was that the economy was so shaky that homeowners simply couldn't access enough financing to purchase their homes because there wasn't enough capital to go around. The second was that developers had less capital to build with. So what happened? Developers made smaller and smaller homes of worse and worse quality in the hopes of snapping up the most desperate homeowners. This created a false sense of supply and demand. Sure, there was demand for housing. There would always be a demand for housing when a population grows, but the demand was for good housing. Unfortunately, the supply of good housing sucked. And as developers lowered the quality of housing to get the most out of their limited resources, demand stagnated. This feedback loop meant developers were disincentivized to create better housing, and the government believed things were going well because there was always a queue of people needing homes, so they were disincentivized to release more capital. The fact that normal citizens were put in dire straits didn't seem to bother either group. Yet this feedback loop persisted. The economy didn't get much better, and housing quality got worse and worse. Strangely, standards had been recommended years earlier in the Parker-Morris Report of 1961. Proposals emphasised the need to distribute heating better, so parlours were abandoned in favour of two living spaces. One would be quiet or communal, like where your TV would go, and another would be for eating, with an enlarged kitchen for modern appliances. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be until 1967 that these recommendations became mandatory in public housing. By that time, developers had created a bountiful stock of bad homes. The only good thing about this period was that at least housing prices stayed relatively stable. Volatility from price increases were decades down the line. But even if you could afford a home, the mortgage rationing became another obstacle between you and home ownership. Frustration from being locked out of the market contributed to economic stagnation because getting onto the property ladder was burdensome, so families opted to rent or move in together. There were all these new houses at stable prices, but no one was buying them. Plus, the only way for developers to economise on mortgage scarcity was to make homes easier to afford, which meant making them shoddier. In essence, the housing market suffered from shrinkflation. Between 1966 and 1977, 77% of new builds were below 1,000 square feet. Almost half of the previous stock had 2 reception rooms, whereas only 1/3 of new builds had them. Buyers had a choice: buy a bad house at the market price, or get a discount on an even worse home. If you think your renting situation is dire, spare a thought for young families trying to get a start in life during the mid-60s. It makes Harry Potter's cupboard under the stairs seem like a trendy studio apartment. As you can expect, the divide between the haves and have-nots widened social inequalities. Middle-class families could turn to the private property market with higher living conditions and more space. These builds came with all the luxurious trimmings of the 1960s. Integrated garages, spacious well-lit halls, and garden patios to capitalise on the British summertime. All 2 weeks of it. Compare that to the Victorian housing that was torn up in the first place, and it was clear how neighbours were on a more even playing field. But by 1965, Wilson's government was already sensing that their plan wasn't working. They introduced some tax revamps to reduce the pain of home ownership. To start, they introduced Britain's first ever capital gains tax. However, owner-occupied houses were exempt, which made them more tax-advantaged than other assets. In layman's terms, this reduced the costs of buying a home so that they became a more tantalising investment compared to other assets. The plan was to attract those with spare cash to use their investments to prop up the housing sector. But this didn't help. It was the equivalent of trying to block a leaky dam by sticking your fingers in the holes, only for the pressure to create even more cracks. That's because these tax breaks ended up raising prices without raising supply or quality. Oops. It was like Wilson's government had inherited a bad economy held together with tape and string, but their way to fix it was to prop it up with a Rube Goldberg machine. As the 1970s approached, many believed the latest homes were inferior quality to older social housing. Compare these two images, and guess which home was built in the 1930s and which was built between 30 and 40 years later. And while all this was happening, wages had been increasing despite Wilson's wage freeze. Yet, even with government subsidies, people weren't buying bigger and higher quality homes like other Western European countries. Instead, Brits were queuing up for dire living quarters like their Eastern European communist counterparts. But that all flipped in 1970. Suddenly, credit was unleashed on the masses. Edward Heath's Conservative Party won the next election and immediately relaxed financial restrictions. This time, the government enacted a policy to use the central bank's interest rate to control the overall money supply. Their theory was that they would simply raise interest rates across the board whenever there was too much money in the system. That way, they wouldn't have to laboriously calculate and enforce lending limits for each bank. Essentially, the Tories reversed the Labour policies which had exacerbated the problems in the housing market. Think of it like instead of trying to reinforce the leaky dam all at once, they'd wait for leaks to appear and deal with them one by one. Like an economist's version of whack-a-mole. And the result? Cash flooded the housing market and everybody lived happily ever after. Just kidding. The inelastic supply of housing just meant that price rises became the fastest ever in British history. Oops. What should have been a way to stimulate growth in the housing and construction sectors did little to stymie the problems, as there still wasn't enough supply to meet demand. First-time buyers were hit hardest by the sudden access to mortgages because now it was a seller's market. In the same way that Wilson's government had been overcautious with an unregulated market, Heath's government had overlooked how relaxing credit controls too much would destabilise pricing. Of course, there were other reasons why inflation was high in the 70s. There was the 1973 oil crisis, passing rising manufacturing costs onto customers, and the continued devaluation of the pound. But the UK government's hope to motivate spending and investment in housing played a key role in reshaping market dynamics. Things got worse in 1972 when unemployment rates rose to a post-war record. Over 1 million people went without work, mostly due to declines in British industry. Even though the previous years had seen a rise in real earnings, the increase in employment coupled with the overpriced housing market was straining the economy to breaking point. Prices were high, cash was low. Something desperate had to be done. So, in his 1972 budget, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Anthony Barber, announced the largest peacetime fiscal stimulus package in British history. The taxes that Wilson had raised were cut, and the spending that was decreased was increased. And the result? Growth. Suddenly, anyone who met the mortgage criteria could get a home loan and even take advantage of generous tax cuts. Housing demand exploded. Increased mortgage lending peaked at 123% by the end of 1972. By 1973, 40% of all mortgages had been approved within the previous 2 years. In just under 10 years, the whole situation had flipped. Well, almost. Little had been done to fix the supply side of things. Nowhere could accommodate the sudden release of housing demand, at least not legally. This meant buyers competed desperately for the homes that had already existed. The same homes they were denied access to before. But having a mortgage to buy them only worsened things for the average citizen. Between 1971 and 1973, prices for these low-quality builds were up 70%. Barber's budget had overheated the general economy. In other words, the Rube Goldberg machine propping up the precarious economy had too many parts. In response, the government removed the stimulus parts, which caused the whole contraption to collapse. The so-called Barber Boom was short-lived, along with any semblance of economic improvement. The mortgage market crashed, leading to a mortgage famine. But maybe it's better to think of it as a mortgage drought, while a leaky dam is threatening to flood the whole village. By mid-1973, inflation was up to 9%, and the pound was under even more pressure thanks to the collapse of the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system. That was basically the equivalent of reaching payday only to realise that a phone app had a sneaky subscription fee. Now the government had no choice but to hike central bank interest rates further. Boosting it by just 4 points was their last-ditch attempt to prevent a currency crisis. Their policy, dubbed competition and credit control, was scrapped. Controls over bank lending were reintroduced. Yet even these efforts weren't enough. Savers and investors withdrew funds from building societies seeking better returns in the market. Between 1973 and 1974, lending from building societies collapsed. Credit was scarce, housing transactions froze, prices fell, but wages weren't exactly increasing. No matter how many fingers the government used to plug the dam, more holes were appearing. Could anything be done? The building societies desperately needed cash, and the most obvious thing would be to increase interest rates. If the building societies want to attract more capital, they would have to raise interest rates to compete with market interest rates, but doing so would have harmed existing mortgage rates. Remember, 40% of mortgages were only a few years old. If these citizens defaulted on their payments, the whole dam would burst. And at these prices, it could trigger a collapse of building societies, banks, and any other lender tangled up in the Rube Goldberg machine of the British housing market. It felt like anyone could make the situation better, but no one had a real solution. Britain was screwed. The country had had a decade of opposing governments trying opposing things to balance the situation. They'd taken turns introducing and repealing policies only for short-term gains to result in deeper long-term problems. Well, in a twist of ironic fate, the key to solving the problem was simple. All they had to do was do nothing. In the end, stagflation came to save the day. Here's how it happened. During the mid-1970s, voters with mortgages could swing the election. When Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath called a snap election in 1974 in response to the famed coal miners' strike, he promptly lost the vote because homeowners had shifted left. Wilson was back in power, but time would tell whether homeowners were just punishing the Tories or actually wanted the government to prop up their flailing building societies. By now, building societies had to bear the brunt of the financial instability. Thankfully for them, rapid inflation wiped out all their debt, although this came at the cost of homeowners and savers. In any case, Wilson wanted to be sure that he knew what voters actually wanted, so he planned another election that autumn. According to legend, he once remarked to a Treasury minister, "Either we prevented the mortgage rate going up and we would win the election, or we allowed it to go up and we would lose the election." But the Conservative Party had also pledged to cap mortgage rates, so Wilson offered the building societies a deal. Cap their rate at 11% instead of the Tories' proposed 7%, and he'll bail them out. It was an offer the building societies couldn't refuse. This move forestalled a massive equity and default crisis by people who had recently sold homes or taken out massive loans. In essence, it prevented a fight or flight response from the people plugging up the leaky dam. But Wilson didn't do it alone. Soaring inflation was also helping to stabilise things. Borrowers had an easier time repaying their loans because the real value of mortgage debt had decreased, even though prices had fallen 40%. So building societies got propped up and homeowners effectively got subsidies. It seems like the crisis was finally over, except for the building developers. They were left holding the bag. They'd been forced to buy land at inflated prices, use little money to build houses that no one wanted, which they couldn't sell because of the retightening of lending practices. Between 1974 and 1977, many house builders went under. The knock-on effect was the construction sector taking a hit, even fewer homes, and an exacerbated housing shortage. But the night is darkest just before dawn. With the 1980s on the horizon, things were finally evening out. The clogged holes and paved cracks in the dam's wall were holding. The meddling that started in 1964 had created almost 15 years of instability, all because governments took turns influencing the housing market through the credit market. If only the likes of Wilson and Heath had understood the concept of supply and demand better. So maybe things would have panned out differently if lending was looser at the start of the 60s and tighter at the end of the decade. And maybe if unemployment and the population hadn't been so high, then the economy would have been more robust. Or maybe, just maybe, the housing market wouldn't have led to our financial crisis if the homes on offer were decent to begin with. But what do you think? Did the baby boom put the government in a catch-22 situation? Or does rapid expansion always come at the cost of quality? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked this video, check out our one on every economic crisis ever. And be sure to subscribe to keep learning how history works.